Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Luke's Gospel. Started a brand new book, Luke's Gospel, and I'm spending a little time um, on the first three verses because there's I think, some truths here that it's worth gleaming over. And by the way, I know I'm starting a little late. I'm actually toying around too if I'm going to change my time. But yeah, this is a late start uh, to the study today. But Luke's was, and to do a little recap, which makes the first three verses why I want to kind of explore that for a moment. Luke, out of the four Gospels, Luke is the only non-Jew. So he was a Gentile. Luke was a physician, and the word physician, they didn't. It wasn't like they were doctors as we know them today. A lot of times, physicians would dabble with herbs and all kinds of. That was kind of their healing things that they would learn. So they didn't necessarily perform surgeries and things like that. But he was a physician. He at some point came across the Apostle Paul and traveled with the Apostle Paul. So at some point, I forget at what point it was. I think it was Acts 16. No, maybe Acts. I forget at what point in the book of Acts that Paul kind of joins Paul's team and kind of travels with him. And what that did was that gave him a lot. He came across a lot of exposure, one, to the gospel itself through Paul. Also, because his gospel, that as we will see in a moment, that he investigated the claims of the early church. Christianity during this time was not um, as popular as it is today. Now, if you say Christianity, everybody pretty much know Christianity. They kind of know of it, but it wasn't. It was a new, you can say, a new religion. It was growing. You can even say it was taking the Roman world by storm, and so people didn't really know what it was. So and so like in Luke's case, he like, let me investigate these claims of Christianity, and then he writes this letter, and he actually wrote Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and Acts, which was his travels and his experiences with the Apostle Paul, and then even becoming acquainted with a lot of the believers um, at Jerusalem. And human nature is human nature. Just like today, people had hero worship. So, for example, a lot of people would say, oh man, there's Peter and there's John. They actually walked with Jesus, and they were legends. They grew to be legends. Now, they didn't entertain it, but actually people would do that. But also, it gave Luke credibility when he wrote his his gospel, his narrative, because of the things he was privileged to be able to investigate and to see. He talked to the eyewitnesses of the Lord. He compiled stories that he heard, that he gained. You can almost say, as I said, as an investigative reporter, his first-hand accounting of it, gathering the knowledge. Um, so let's bring this up here. And I guess I should click on Luke's Gospel. Here we go. Luke's Gospel. So again, it says, inasmuch as many as taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, delivered them to us. So again, notice he said, many has taken in hand to set in order a narrative. And I kind of got into this last time, how in the early church, they were not stingy about, let's say, making copies. I mean, there are thousands of copies. I think to date, as far as manuscripts, and this is important, why our scriptures is intact. So in what we have today are some 25,000 copies of copies, and believed to be some 5,000 copies or original copies. So when I say a copy, what do I mean? So when Luke wrote this, he probably wrote it on what's called a papyri plant, dried out papyri plant, and then the ink was like, sometimes it could be soot that they would water down and soot, and then that's how they wrote. So this was not in any kind of way durable. So we do not have any of the, let's say, the original letter that Luke wrote, because it's probably just, again, faded. It was flawed, flimsy. But over time, you would see people would write copies upon copies upon copies upon copies. They just write. They never, you had all. They were not shy about copying the letters. Okay. For example, if you look at a musician who produces a song, okay, and I'm not criticizing it, but if you got a musician who criticizes a song, that they don't want you to make copies. In fact, I think there's even the thing about even getting music off of the internet. They don't want that, because what? They want the sales. Now the same thing with an author. An author writes a book. They don't want you making copies. So copies upon copies. So, but in the Christian world, they made copies upon copies. They were not shy about making copies. Okay, they were not shy about making copies. So these copies upon copies upon copies. Got to add some of my peeps here. Okay. So yeah, they were not. Here we go. All right. So yeah, they were not. They were not shy on that. They were not shy to say, okay, you know what? Hey, So that's why I said today we have some 25,000 copies of copies, and then we have like some 25,000 copies of copies, right? And then 5,000 original copies. All right. So, but notice he says, inasmuch as many have taken hand and set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So who is he talking about? He is getting this information. Luke is getting this information from the eyewitnesses. So one eyewitness that he was closely associated with was the Apostle Paul. And then he would come across other eyewitnesses such as Peter, James, and then maybe the other apostles, the Jerusalem church, the elders at Jerusalem. Okay. So the way that how God preserved this word, the way that God sent out, remember, you had Jesus who came, right? The word manifested in the flesh. He comes of age at the age of 30, and then he begins to what? He begins to minister. He chooses 12 apostles. One of the apostles betrayed him, Judas. And then after the resurrection, after Jesus ascended to heaven, you can say after the resurrection, he was then replaced. He was chosen. I think his name was Matthias, right? Those apostles were eyewitnesses. By the way, Matthias, even when the apostles chose Matthias, they chose someone who had been with Jesus from the beginning. Now, we're going to see that in this gospel here. For example, in chapter 10, Jesus is going to send out 70 disciples. Okay? 70 disciples. So what you had Jesus, who had his 12 apostles, and they were his main. Then you had an extended number of disciples, minimum of 70. And then even that, you had even a larger crowd. So when they chose Matthias, they chose from that crowd, from possibly the 70 who had been with him all along. And what else? What that qualified them, they were eyewitnesses of the events of Jesus' life, of the gospel thing. They were eyewitnesses of that. Okay. So, verse 2, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Now, in the case of the 12 apostles, and then also including the apostle Paul, not only were they eyewitnesses, but they preached the message of the gospel with signs and wonders. So then when they wrote, their message was truth. They were the standard of truth. They've been with him. So they were the standard of truth. And not only that, but God had validated those eyewitnesses, meaning the apostles, with signs and wonders, demonstrating that the word, the truth that they were speaking came from God. Now, there were people, notice he said, inasmuch as many have taken in hand, and said in order a narrative. Now, he's not saying that whether they were good or bad, but there were people, even then, that were saying things that were not the gospel. And then later on, as you get into the 2nd century, it even got worse. You had people lying, saying, oh yeah, I was with Jesus. I hung out with Jesus. I was one of the apostles. I was, my cousin, my uncle was one, he walked with Jesus, right? And then the leaders of that time would discover that they were liars. Okay. So verse 3 said, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all these things from the very first. So here's the thing right here. It seemed, I have purpose. Now, how did Luke have that? One, he was with one of the chief apostles, the Apostle Paul. And remember, in Paul's travels, he came across the original apostles. Luke rubbed elbows with. Okay, and I'm going to say by God's providence too. Why? He says, so verse 3, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all these things. How did he get that understanding? His acquaintance with the Apostle Paul, his being around, traveling with the Apostle Paul, having come across a lot of the early believers, the who's who of the believers. So then he says, it seems good to me also, having had perfect understanding in all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. Now, we don't know who Theophilus is. He certainly seems to be a man, a prominent man, somewhere high up in the Roman government, because notice most excellent Theophilus. And then he says, so he and think about this too. So here's Luke writing to this man who he knows. We don't know what brought about the occasion of the writing. Now, in the Bible, we have seen throughout the biblical history that God would raise up men and put them in position that they would be able to speak to kings. For example, Abraham, right? Abraham spoke to the kings. Abraham not only spoke to the kings, but had a good relationship with the kings. On one occasion, rebuked one of the kings. Of course, then you had Joseph, who became prime minister. He was number two under he was number two under Pharaoh. That he had Pharaoh's ear. Joseph was so great. Basically, Pharaoh said whatever he says. He actually said this: "You're going to live and die at this man's command." So at some point, all those people that did him wrong were probably shaking in their boots. Okay. I'm going to say Moses, although it was kind of more uh, opposing. Okay. But isn't it interesting how Moses was able to walk up into Pharaoh's court? Okay. And so my point is that you see people throughout history. Daniel, of course, had several audiences with Nebuchadnezzar, and I think Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and then some of the Mede and Persian kingdoms. And they would seek out Daniel's counsel, right? They would seek out Daniel's counsel. Now, you also come into the book of Acts, and you saw the same thing. The last 5 chapters of Acts is you see God's providence, how Paul, through his arrest, was able to speak to high Roman officials. And so here's Luke. And as far as the timing of Luke, we don't know. Some people put it, I think around the late 50s, when you say 80, 50s. When you think about the timeline of the New Testament, so you start with the birth of Jesus, and some people believe that to be somewhere around the neighborhood of 3 to 4 BC, which is kind of funny because then what is the whole point of AD and then the switch over, right? So you got BC and then AC, right? In terms of a date, and of course, whose calendar you're going to go on. So by the time of AD 30, right? Okay, Jesus comes to age, depending on how you want to date this. So I'm not a scholar, so I'm not. But then you see the his crucifixion around, depending on AD 30, right? If he was born 4 BC. If you want to say he was born at 80, I would say it make more sense. I'm not saying it happened that way, but just from the standpoint of AD versus BC, right? Now, and so 80, 30, and then he ascends to heaven, and then the church gets into full swing. The Apostle Paul, it's kind of hard to tell when he comes on the scene. It is believed somewhere around 80, 36, 37, maybe 40, somewhere around there. And then he starts his ministry. Now, what is interesting, of course, about this letter here, was this after Paul's being arrested? Was this after Paul's death? We don't know. So anyway, he says here that the reason why he's writing this, right, that you may know the certainty of the things in which you were instructed. So at some point, the Theophilus was instructed. He would preach the gospel. The gospel was taught to him. And it seemed like even maybe Luke wanted to make sure that the information that he was receiving was accurate. That the information that I want to make sure you know the accurate information of the gospel. And even today, we wrestle with the same thing. Every denomination has their own quirky view on the gospel. But the good news is that we have the gospel. Like now, we're actually reading, see, the letters of Luke. So in a sense, what Luke is saying here applies to us. That having perfect understanding in all the things from the very first to write to you, us, an orderly account that we may know the certainty of the things in which we were instructed. That beats all. That we may know the certainty of the things in which we were instructed. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in the next study.